Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to Parenting in the 21st Century. I'm Zina Shevchik. Today we have with us Professor Bruce Svare from the Department of Psychology at the University of Albany. He's here to discuss with us the American sports culture and how it impacts our children. Thank you very much for taking the time to come today, Professor.
I'm pleased to be here.
I have here your book that was published in 2004 with the provocative title, Reforming Sports Before the Clock Runs Out, One Man's Journey Through Our Runaway Sports Culture. And in the dedication of this book, you have written to the parents of our next generation of young athletes and to the millions of young American athletes who continue to be affected by a sports culture that fails them. Can you explain just how the American sports culture fails our children?
Sure, I'd be happy to. We have, I know, a limited amount of time, but before I even answer that question, I'd like to say that I love sports. I have been involved in sports at many different levels, as a player, as a coach, from kids that are very young all the way up to the elite amateur level. I have two boys who have participated in sports who had great experiences, and I had great experiences as well as an athlete and as a coach. But in spite of that love that I have, I've seen certain things by way of my own observations, by way of the research that I've done, which indicates to me that things could be a lot better. That we are, in fact, in a situation right now where sports, I think, are way too serious, especially for our young people, that there's too much in terms of resources that are being put into sports, that it's too often, even at the younger levels, it's a business. And I think that what gets sacrificed in that is what sports should really be about. And that's character development. It's about learning about sportsmanship. It's about learning about ethics and fair play. Certainly about learning the fundamentals of a sport. But I think that given the huge economic rewards that are out there now for sports, between athletic scholarships and professional contracts and so on, I think that the true essence of sport is really being overlooked. And it's no longer the priority that it should be.
How did it get that way?
Well, the simple answer to that question, I think, is money. Professional sports and Olympic sports being at the very top of that pyramid, where there is so much money that's involved on so many different levels. And certainly the athletes at that level are being paid more than ever. But also the changes that took place in our colleges and universities certainly contributed to it as well in terms of athletic scholarships. So it's the economic rewards of sport that's really driving many of the changes that have occurred over the last, certainly over the last 40 or 50 years, which has really reached, in some cases, almost an obscene level.
So that means that it's the consumers, if there's a consumers there to spend the money on sports as entertainment or as business, then it's us, the consumer, the U.S. consumer, that makes it, I would assume, that creates the fire behind the whole business. And
yes.
And so does that mean that we can't go back to what sports meant when you and I maybe were children?
Well, I think we have to differentiate between You know, sport as entertainment, which is what we see at the college level, and certainly at the professional and the Olympic level, versus amateur sports at the high school level and the youth level. I think that what is happening is that increasingly we're viewing high school sports and even youth sports, unfortunately. Take the Little League World Series that gets played out on television now. We're increasingly viewing that as entertainment. And I think that when you start to do that, then there are all kinds of compromises that are being made. And part of that compromise is that we view young athletes as part of that equation to make money. And I think that that's very dangerous.
I have to say that in preparing for this interview, I read something that I think rings true to me. I mean, some other people may not agree, but I'm at the edge of the beginning of the baby boom generation, and they talked about how, this article I read talks about how our generation has made parenting into a competitive sport. Mm-hmm. And I really do agree with that. You know, so many of my peers attended college. We learned how to do things. We learned the value of education, and we took that into parenting as well. We learned how to parent from books, and and we also wanted to achieve. And I have to say that I see that in my own suburban life, and I don't know what the answer to that is, because as long as people at the bottom level, at the parenting, it stays that way, I'm not sure I see a way to avoid that, the commercialization, or, as you said, sport, high school sport, children's sport as entertainment, unless the educators get involved, and that, I assume, means the coaches as well. And do you agree with that?
Well, you see, there's a fundamental imbalance here that needs to be addressed. And again, I think that we're directing our questions towards what's happening at the youth level and the high school level in terms of sports. Sports are really, at that level, about enjoyment for the athlete. Whether it's a young person playing sports for the very first time or a high school athlete, we should be most concerned about their enjoyment, the fun that they're having. It's not about our enjoyment as adults. Instead, it's about how much they're getting out of their participation. Unfortunately, that balance has shifted towards we're more concerned about mom and dad. We're more concerned about their enjoyment. We're more concerned, in the case of sports, in terms of winning, and we're more concerned about championships, and we're more concerned about athletic scholarships. That has predominated, especially over the last 20 years, to the point now where parents' needs are being satisfied, kids' needs aren't. And kids want to have fun, they want to participate, they want to be with their friends, they want to have a good time with what they're doing. They could care less about winning and losing. They just want to play. They want to have a good time. Mom and dad don't see it that way. So there's a disconnect there. And until we bring those things back into balance, and we care as much about kids and their enjoyment of sport and participation in sport, until we get to that point, there's no hope. This is going to continue on with early specialization, with kids at a very early age, playing sports year-round, a single sport year-round. It's going to be translated into the kinds of sports injuries that you see now that are due, predominantly they're overuse injuries. They're because kids are playing one sport too much and they're not using a variety of different muscle and skeletal groups. It's going to be translated into drug abuse problems for performance-enhancing drugs, where kids at a younger and younger age are using things like anabolic steroids in order to get better at their sport. It's going to be translated into terrible sportsmanship problems that we have now with parents too often too invested in what's going on and exhibiting behaviors that are outrageous to the point where there are lawsuits being filed by parents against coaches, coaches against parents, school districts against coaches, school districts against parents. It's a situation which, from my way of viewing things, is really out of control. But again, it's all about this imbalance. It's all about satisfying adult needs more so than we want to satisfy kids' needs.
I agree with you. Can you tell me how schools got involved with the sports programs, or how sports got involved in schools in the United States? Because I understand that that's not the way it is in most of the rest of the world.
We are the only country in the world that runs sports, organized sports through our schools. In every other country in the world, sports are run outside schools by way of club programs, which are funded usually by corporations, but also a combination of corporations, local government, state government, and national government. But it's rare to see, as in our case here in the United States, individual school districts sponsoring sports. It just doesn't happen that way. Why did it happen here? Well, it's a very interesting story. I'll give you the short story. With the immigration here to the United States at the turn of the century, a number of different things happened. Corporations wanted individuals that were trained well, that were people that were of high character, people that would be good in the workforce, be responsible individuals. With the influx of so many immigrants here to the United States, an expanding school system, and sports being played outside the schools at that time in club programs, there was the perception, and indeed the reality was, that a lot of those club programs were not run very well. And given the demands of the workforce and the fact that we could teach character through sports, it was thought that this would be a natural place for it to happen in schools. So principals then began taking on the responsibilities of running sports in their schools. And one thing led to another, to the point where we now have a highly organized system of sports in our country that are run through schools and colleges and universities.
Now, I know we hear stories, or it's in the papers and the news, about sports crazed people in other parts of the world, but that's exclusively club sports, you're saying, like the major soccer. Are they professionals, or are those club sports?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have, we haven't dominated that scene in terms of parents being out of control and coaches being out of control. I mean, that happens all over the world. I think that it's not something that is just exclusively seen here in this country. So those kinds of things do happen, certainly outside the confines of scholastic sports and college sport, intercollegiate sports. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned was it being all about money, and I would like you to perhaps tell our audience about what the chances are of people getting athletic scholarships and actually going on to pro sports, because I know from my own experience, personal experience with my children, that is something that kids, at least the kids' parents, aspire to. Yeah. So, if you could.
The chances of a high school varsity athlete getting an athletic scholarship at a Division I school or a Division II school is 3 out of 100. For every 100 varsity athletes, 3 will ultimately get an athletic scholarship. Now, that needs to be couched in some facts that I think a lot of parents simply aren't aware of. There are very few sports, just football and basketball, that give what are typically called a full ride, meaning tuition, room and board, books taken care of, all your costs. That happens for football and for men's and women's basketball. For other sports, consider your minor sports, lacrosse, soccer, golf, rifle, so many of the other, volleyball, track and field. Those sports typically give partial scholarships. And indeed, the average scholarship that is given today, if you combine all those sources, whether you're talking about the major sports, football and basketball, or the so-called minor sports, if you group them all together, the average scholarship is about $10,000. So we're really not talking about a huge amount of money. And when parents begin talking about a full ride, it automatically clicks in with me that, do they really know what they're talking about here? Because, again, full ride is seen in cases of, the revenue-producing sports, football and men's and women's basketball. For the other sports, they may have a couple of full scholarships, but they kind of divvy out their scholarships to all their athletes so that everybody gets a little something. That, I think, a lot of parents don't realize until their son or daughter signs on the dotted line.
Until their child's childhood is gone.
If I could just add something else there
Sure,
that I think is
absolutely.
very important for your viewers. Athletic scholarships these days are not what they used to be in terms of a 4-year guarantee. Prior to 1983, scholarships were given by the NCAA for a 4-year commitment. That was regardless of whether you were a recruiting failure or they really didn't think that you were going to work out on their team, or you all of a sudden didn't like sports anymore, or you weren't doing well in class, or your scholarship could not be taken away from you. It's totally different now. Scholarships now are 1 year, renewable. What that means is that oftentimes athletes have to prioritize their life. And in order to get that scholarship the next year, they got to be performing on the athletic field. So it becomes a full-time job at the highest levels of intercollegiate sports, where too often you have students who are absolutely dead tired. They can't make it to a lot of their classes. Their travel and training schedules are so extensive that they really can't make a good commitment to the classroom. And too often they're funneled into majors that are not real challenging, in which they're not getting the same kind of education that other students are getting. Compromises are being made in the classroom, and I think that that's very unfortunate, and that does happen on a regular basis at the highest levels of intercollegiate sports, the Division I level.
That must also mean that if you're not playing because of sports injuries, you may not get a renewal as well.
That's correct.
And I assume if you're that exhausted from trying to balance, you're not feeding your body the way you should, or treating your body the way you should either. I also want to mention, since it's relatively, I still have 2 children in college, is that $10,000 in a private university, that's, if you're lucky, that's a quarter of what it costs. I mean, what we were looking at even a couple of years ago was about $45,000 to $50,000 a year for a private school. So that's really not that much money. And I don't know what the statistics are, and I think maybe after this program I'll try to find out what the percentage of kids are who get academic scholarships.
Well, I can tell you what the
you do know
total
that.
amount of money is. It's very interesting. The total amount of money that's available for athletic scholarships by the NCAA, that's for Division I and Division II. Division III does not offer scholarships. Okay, that's all need-based. But Division I and Division II, the total amount of money that is given for athletic scholarships is about $10 billion. The total amount of money that's available for academic scholarships is in the neighborhood of $22 billion. So there's a lot more available for academic scholarships. Now, that message isn't getting home. It's especially not getting home to, unfortunately, African Americans in our urban centers, because too often the way out is considered to be through athletics. And in fact, your chances of becoming a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a professional in some career is far greater than becoming a professional athlete or an Olympic athlete. So unfortunately, there's, that message just rarely gets out. And I think that it's, again, athletic scholarships are viewed as being this really wonderful thing that's going to lead to opportunities, greater opportunities. It leads to athletic opportunities, but it does not lead, unfortunately, to really good academic and career opportunities.
Right, right. Would you recommend parents who are hopefully our audience should be aware of? What should they look for? What questions should they ask when they're considering putting their children or having their children participate in formal sports programs, whether it's at what I would call the club or local level versus the school level? I assume there's...
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And my standard answer for it is this. For any kind of a community-based program, sports program, youth program, I would be most interested in knowing whether or not that program treats its least talented athletes as well as its most talented athletes. For example, the trend in many communities is to devote much of its resources to travel team play, select team play, regional development of athletes, as opposed to recreational play, where kids in a community are learning a sport, learning of the fundamentals, learning about teamwork, learning about ethics in sports, learning about sportsmanship. Instead, it's this quest to develop better athletes. I've said all along, I've said in many different venues, that sports, youth sports, are not about building better athletes. They're about building better people. Building better people in terms of teaching about character, teaching about sportsmanship, teaching about ethics, yes, teaching about the fundamentals of a sport. But unfortunately, it's become, how early can we separate out the better athletes from the ones that aren't so good? And this is happening at earlier and earlier ages. It's something that some of us have called soccer creep, where kids at a younger and younger age are being sorted out into who's good, who's not so good, who's lousy at that particular age, at a very, very young age. And that is just absolutely destructive, absolutely destructive. It's a worst possible thing that a youth sports program could be doing. Instead, what they should be doing is developing all the kids, making sure that all the kids are being given a good exposure to a particular sport. But unfortunately, we've gone in the other direction, and it's all about going for athletic scholarships and winning and separating out kids at a very early age and favoring their development over other kids, giving them more opportunities, more resources. I think that that's, for many different reasons, is a bad way to go. And I can elucidate those, but I'm not sure you want to
Well,
go in that direction or you want to go in another direction.
What I would like to know is it possible to find programs teaching how to be better people instead of just teaching, athletic skills? Is it possible these days?
I think that there's pockets of that out there. I think that there are people who really get it, who really understand, what youth sports are supposed to be about. But unfortunately, they're getting overwhelmed by the other element, by the element of adults who really see this as a way of developing athletes. Quickly, there's a couple of myths here that I talk about whenever I go out and talk about these issues. There's two really important myths. One myth is that you have to take a kid at a very early age, immediately, and start them with intensive training so that they'll have an opportunity later on to be, this athlete that's going to get an athletic scholarship. Early specialization. I call it the Tiger Woods syndrome. There are many parents who believe that their son first, daughters first start showing an interest in basketball, then it's got to be basketball 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Because Tiger Woods had a golf club in his hand when he was 8 months of age and started playing competitively when he was 2 or 3. They overlooked the fact that Tiger Woods had a lot of God-given, genetically endowed abilities, right, that probably would have emerged anyway, all right? You can't immerse your average kid in that kind of a very intense exposure and expect that specialization to be translated into Tiger Woods. So that's myth number one. The second myth is that specialization at an early age and separating out kids at an early age necessarily translates into an interest in that sport later on and highly skilled performance later on. There's lots of studies that were done at the University of Michigan that are called the athletic brilliance studies, in which they tracked kids from an early age, the ones that were good at a particular sport, and followed them. And they weren't necessarily the ones who turned out to be the better athletes later on. Looking from my own background that I've had kids that I coached at young levels of basketball that couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time when they were in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. But by the time they got up to high school level, they were very good players. And some of them even got athletic scholarships and played competitively in college. So you can't really predict. And this whole notion that specialization should occur at a real early age. I've talked with a lot of college athletes, elite athletes, Olympic athletes, and I've asked them that question. When did you specialize? When did you throw everything else out in terms of, other sports that you were interested in? They said, not till my sophomore, junior year in high school. So this whole approach then, that it has to be this intensive kind of training at a very early part of development is just absolutely wrong. And it is something that occurs nationwide, and there is a real investment in this now by parents at a very early age in terms of intensive training, counselors, coaches, nutritionists, and so on. There's a whole subculture that's developed now because they believe that specialization at an early age is the route to maybe positioning yourself for an athletic scholarship.
And that's not necessarily so.
It's not necessarily so. No.
I know that one of your one of the areas you specialize in is steroid and drug abuse. Could you talk about that a little bit? And,
sure.
And how it relates to high school and youth sports?
Here's the scene. More and more kids now are turning to using performance-enhancing drugs like anabolic steroids. They see their sports icons doing it. They see these things in the news all the time about world-class athletes having used steroids to get better at their sport. And the pressure is on them to perform at a very early age and to perhaps position themselves for, starts out at the middle school level with a middle school kid thinking, what's it going to take in order to make the varsity? So they might be tempted to use steroids. High school varsity player thinking, well, what's it going to take to be a scholarship player in college? Maybe I should use some of this to position myself for it. And then once that individual is in college and they're on athletic scholarship, they say, I want to make it to the pros. Maybe I'll use some of this stuff too. There's a trickle-down effect from the highest level of sports right now to all the way down to kids as young as 5th and 6th grade. There's documented evidence of this now, where kids, again, because of all this pressure that's going on to perform, and much of it exerted by parents, it's being translated into the following numbers. There's approximately 1 million middle school, high school age kids in this country that in this past year tried or cycled one time on anabolic steroids. Again, some kids as young as 5th and 6th grade. Now, how does that convert out to your average high school? Let's say your average high school, middle school population is about 1,000 students. 30 to 40 kids are using. That's scary. That's very scary in view of what these things can do to you. It's like a time bomb. Anabolic steroids that are being used are silent killers. We know enough about them now to know that if they're used chronically, they can result in all kinds of physical and behavioral changes. And one of the most scary parts about all this is that they're increasingly being used by young girls. And it can compromise all kinds of issues regarding reproduction in women.
So this is a downside of Title IX?
Well, maybe to a certain extent. Yeah, there's upside and downside of Title IX, for sure. More and more girls are having the opportunity to play sports, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, because the mold is that of the male and the intense pressure that we put on males, more and more we see the same kinds of things happening in women's sports that we have observed and regretted in terms of male sports.
Before we go, I would like you to tell us about your education and your background, your experience. I know that from reading about you that you are as well the director of the National Institute for Sports Reform, and also that you were a Fulbright Scholar to Thailand. So could you just give us a brief biography before we leave?
I started out not knowing what I wanted to do when I was an undergraduate in college. And I cycled through being a major in biology, then math. Then I was a language major for a while. Then I was a sociology major for a while. And then finally I became a psychology major when I got turned on by a course in experimental psychology that a professor was teaching, who I became very close with. One thing led to another. I started working in his laboratory, done a lot of work in the area of hormones and behavior, the study of hormonal effects upon behavior, and went to graduate school and ultimately got my degree in a field which is called biopsychology, which is the study of the biological basis of behavior. Did a 3-year postdoctoral stay at a place in Massachusetts called the Worcester Foundation for Experimental Biology, which was the place where the mechanisms behind the pill were first investigated. I had a wonderful experience there, and then was fortunate to get hired at State University of New York at Albany in the psychology department, where I've been, this is my 30th year now, where I've been involved with our biopsychology program, still do research in the area of hormones and behavior, but have, because of my interest in sports and in performance-enhancing drugs, I've kind of transitioned a little bit into being, I guess, what you would call a social activist, and I don't mind that title at all. I'm out there. I'm a cynic. I'm trying to tell the truth about a lot of these things that are going on right now, and I enjoy that immensely. I'm contacted a lot, almost on a daily basis, by people in the media that want certain information and questions answered about issues in sports, and I love that. It gives me an opportunity, I think, to get some information out there that I think parents could find useful for their kids.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I certainly appreciate your time with us. Wish we had more time. You obviously have a lot of knowledge to impart. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
It's been great to be here, and it's wonderful that we have community programs like this. So I give you a lot of credit for being at the forefront of that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us today, Parenting in the 21st Century.